evening, ladies and gentlemen. Here we go. Good evening, and welcome to the 11th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture. We have a really good turnout here, and we're going to have some wonderful speakers and a great evening. I'm pleased to be your mistress of ceremonies for this evening as we gather to recognize the contributions of our keynote speaker, Congressman Ronald Dellums, who is right here at table 4. A couple of years after I left. The center fulfills its mission by promoting research and academic programs, maintaining a library, putting on special projects, and publishing current work in African American studies. It is one of the leading centers of its kind in the United States. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to the director. On African American literature with essays on writers such as Frederick Douglass, Pauline Hopkins, and of course Richard Wright. A co-editor of the Norton Anthology of African American Literature and the Associate General Editor of the Heath Anthology of American Literature. He is also the General Editor of Northeastern University Press's Library of Black Literature. I'm very pleased to present to you Professor Richard Yarborough.
Thank you very much. It is my pleasure as Director of the Center for African American Studies to welcome you to our 11th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture and Benefit Dinner featuring I Am Honored. With more than 25 years of experience as a producer, reporter, television news anchor, and television host. Glenda's news reports and specials have won UPI Golden Mike Awards, Emmy nominations, a San Francisco State University Broadcast Media Award, and awards from the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services, American Heart Association, and state and city local governments. She has taught broadcast news writing at the University of Southern California and belongs to numerous professional organizations. We're extremely pleased to have her with us this evening. UCLA. Over those 3 decades, the center has come to be recognized as one of the most distinguished African American studies units in the country, and we can point with pride to our exemplary academic and scholarly achievements. We are happy to be able to share our successes with you this evening, and we want to express our deepest gratitude for your generous support of the student scholarship programs and research projects, which the proceeds from this event will help to maintain. We also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge Center in such glowing terms tonight. Now more than ever before, with challenges to the goal of diversity being mounted on so many fronts, we need not just to call attention to the roots of the center and the activism of the 1960s, but also to rededicate ourselves to carrying on that tradition of activism as we enter the new century, fighting battles that are not dissimilar to those engaged by previous generations. Accordingly, I want to take a few moments here and publicly recognize some very special guests. And these are faculty, administrators, students who have played a role back in the day. And I just want to acknowledge them publicly. Gordon Berry, Beverly Bruce, Tony Cook, Cheryl Dearman, Winston Derby, Daniel Skip Johnson, Hank McGee, Claudia Mitchell-Kerman, founders and nurturers of the center. It's a real pleasure for me. I have seen the names of a couple of these individuals and never actually had the honor of meeting them. And let me just announce as well that tomorrow at 5 o'clock on campus we will have a couple of symposia and a celebratory reception in honor of the 30th anniversary of the Center for African American Studies. You're certainly all invited to that event. Roseanne, City Administrative Officer of Inglewood. If each of you could indicate where you're seated. There's the mayor and Mr. Roseanne. Thank you very much for coming. It's a real pleasure. At this point, I want to call attention to a very special group of supporters for the center. They are the Center for African American Studies Advisory Board. And after 19 years of service. During his long career, Judge Luke has served as an adjunct professor at Loyola Law School, Chief Deputy Assessor for the Los Angeles County Assessor's Office, and President of the Los Angeles City Planning Commission. Active in various organizations around Los Angeles, he is a member of the Jazz Bakery Board of Directors, the UCLA Foundation Board of Governors, and the California Judges Association. He's also the co-chair of the UCLA Center for African American Studies Advisory Board. Judge Luke has been honored by UCLA with the Alumni Award for Excellence in University Service. His co-chair is Renee L. Campbell. Chairman of the Los Angeles County Regional Planning Commission. She's a member of the California State Bar Association and president of the California Association of Black Lawyers Foundation. And I would like to invite them up, but as they're making their way here, I want to read the names of another group of supporters, the other members of that Center Advisory Board. And I know you're eating, but if you could stand briefly when I read your name as Renee and Cheryl make their way up here. Rita Rothman, Marion Broom, Ashe Gassaway, Dr. C.Z. Wilson, Shirley Jo Finney, Bobby Smith. Bobby's got some porters back there. Professor Valerie Smith, Carolyn Rouse, Dr. Carolyn Rouse, and our development director, Kathy Kim, without whom this would not be happening. Please join me in thanking this group for their generous support. Okay. Now Renee Campbell and Judge Cheryl Luke.
Thank you so much, Richard, for your very generous remarks. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this wonderful evening. We are all very excited about this year's Thurgood Marshall Lecturer, the Honorable Congressman Ronald Dellums, whom you'll be hearing from later this evening.
But first, we'd like to give recognition to our sponsors, both individual and corporate sponsors in various categories. Our gold sponsors, and I'm going to ask you to stand, either the sponsor or the sponsor's representative, as I call your name or the name of the organization. Our gold sponsors include HNTB Corporation, and Vice Chancellor Winston Dobie. Where are you, Winston? There you are. And our silver sponsors include our co-chair, Renee Campbell. Okay. Rita Rothman? Rita. Okay. Sony Picture Entertainment? State Farm Insurance Company? And the UCLA Chancellor's Office. Renee?
Okay, thank you, Judge Luke. I also want to for her generous contribution. Thank you so much. And it's my pleasure to thank our community sponsors, and it's so important to us to have these sponsors as well. The Afro-American Studies Interdepartmental Program, and Ase Gasaway, who's also on our board, works very hard for the center. Vice Chancellor Winston Dobie, the McDonald's Corporation, our board member Bobby Smith, Watts Health Systems, and our alum from UCLA Law School is Alma Graham, and Dr. C.Z. Wilson, who's also on our board of directors. We want to thank all of you for your generosity and your support of our Center for African American Studies. And now we will turn the program back to our very lovely Mistress of Ceremonies, Ms. Glenda Weena. Thank you so much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my pleasure to do what we call on television, taking this program to a break. I want to thank you, Renee, very much for those kind words, and to Cheryl. Coming up after the break for dinner, Vice Chancellor Claudia Mitchell-Kernan, Chancellor Carnesell, our keynote speaker, Congressman Ron Dellums, and much, much more. So we hope that you'll stay with us, ladies and gentlemen. In the meantime, enjoy your dinner. Of Anthropology and Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences. In 1994, President Clinton appointed her to the National Science Board, which is quite an honor. Dr. Mitchell Kernan received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and her BA from Indiana University. Prior to coming to UCLA in 1973, Dr. Mitchell Kernan was on the faculty at Harvard University. Much of her early work was in the area of linguistic anthropology. Her classic research in the late 1960s and early 1970s on the speech patterns of black children is widely cited to this day. Dr. Mitchell Kernan's work on Caribbean cultures and the mentally retarded is also highly regarded. Her most recent book, published in 1996, I love that, her most recent book, how many of us have written even one, is entitled The Decline in Marriage Among African Americans. Other books include such topics as children's discourse, television and the socialization of ethnic minority children, and linguistic patterns of African American children. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Vice Chancellor Claudia Mitchell Kernan.
Thank you very much, Glenda. There are a number of lives in there, and I appreciate such a wonderful introduction. I have a special task this afternoon, but I wanted to take the opportunity before my special task of saying what a very special and wonderful evening this is for me, and to join others in welcoming you. It's quite an extraordinary opportunity to be in a room with so many people whom I so love and cherish, and who have had a role in my life going back more than 30 years. One of the people here that I think from those old times is my first doctoral student at Harvard. And it's just kind of absolutely astounding to walk into this room and to see her there. I won't tell many stories, but hers is, I think, a very interesting story, because when she applied to the Department of Anthropology at Harvard, I was in Central America, and there are not a lot of phones in Central America, and I was moving around the country planning to stage field sites for Harvard undergraduates to be able to come down and join me in doing research. The country believes is very, very rich in ethnic diversity and linguistic diversity. It's a wonderful place to think about, and safe place at the time to think about taking undergraduate students. And I was stopping off at places called, with names like Bangriga, Punta Gorda, Yankee Viejo del Carmen, Cayo, and every place I go, there'd be a little note, Claudia, phone home. There were no phones. And finally, I did catch up with the phone and learn that she was interested in coming, and I was delighted. I thought she was just an exciting prospect for a beginning assistant professor who was interested in working with me. And for goodness sake, she had come from UCLA. So it was a strange, strange path. And she's here tonight because she was a very important part of the founding of the Center for African American Studies. There are other special students here from undergraduate years whom I very much cherish, and I won't stop to mention names, but I'm always impressed with one of them, John Caldwell, who remembers my lectures. He's smart. I really am impressed with that. It's sort of, when you're a professor and you're teaching and you sort of look out at an audience, you sort of very often wonder how much of this is getting across. And it's extraordinary what he remembers, and it's also extraordinary the things that he remembers, because they're the things that I thought were important. So it's great to be here, and it's great to have this next honor and pleasure, and that is to introduce the Chancellor of UCLA, our Chancellor, Carnesale. He has been at the helm of UCLA for nearly 3 years now. He is an extraordinarily successful university administrator. Our paths did not cross at Harvard, but he did come to us from the provostship at Harvard in 1997. He is a renowned scholar of international affairs and has served very, very widely as a consultant on foreign and defense matters. As a matter of fact, he has served as a consultant to every president of the United States since Richard Nixon. He has an impressive history as a scholar and as a skilled negotiator, and we are really delighted with the success he has had in accomplishing the very, very important work that he does at UCLA. I am very personally grateful to Chancellor Carnesale for his commitment to the ongoing success of African American studies at UCLA. I don't know if I've ever told this little short story, but when he came to UCLA in 1997, one of the first briefings that he requested from me as Vice Chancellor of Academic Affairs was to tell him more about African American studies and our ethnic studies programs. It was a wonderful experience to have a new chancellor who thought that this was a priority. His support of the center's teaching, research, and public service endeavors inspires our work and spurs us on, I think, to even greater achievements. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my very, very great pleasure to present to you Albert Carnesale, Chancellor of the University of California, Los Angeles.
Well, I'm certainly not going to match that introduction. Thank you, Claudia. I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of UCLA. And this, as you know, the 11th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture. It's a great privilege for me to be here. And it's also a great privilege for me to welcome our distinguished speaker this evening, Ron Dellums. And I want to thank Richard Yarborough, for the director of the Center for African American Studies, who you heard earlier, for all of his work, as well as the event co-chairs, Renee Campbell and Judge Cheryl Lake, for their efforts in making this such a special evening. Now, UCLA Center for African American Studies, as you know and as you've heard, just over 3 decades ago, was founded 31 years ago, 1969. The mission was clear at the time, and it's one that the center certainly has fulfilled admirably and continues to fulfill, and that's to develop strong research programs, strong teaching programs, and strong service programs related to African American studies, because after all, that's the mission of a university: education, research, and service. And what makes a research university different is that not simply that we do all three, but that they're integrated, that the same people do all three: education, research, and service. So we combine them and get all the synergies that go with them. The center also oversees the granting of undergraduate and graduate degrees in African American studies. It administers the scholarship programs that so many of you have been helpful in making possible. The publications intended not only for scholars, but for others as well, anyone anywhere who's interested in people of African descent worldwide. The Special Projects Division of the center is very active in the greater Los Angeles region and hosts events there, helps young people there, and hosts events such as this. So this is an important part of what UCLA is about. The center is an integral part of our university. We're proud of its long history and are committed to ensuring that it continues on the wonderful trajectory that it's enjoyed thus far. Let me say a few words about Mr. Justice Thurgood Marshall. First of all, upon the death of Mr. Justice Marshall, in 1993, a Washington newspaper editorial had a wonderful, not quite obituary, but tribute to him, in which it stated that every day we live with the legacy of Justice Thurgood Marshall. And that's true for all of us. It was a remarkable career, some of which not known as broadly as it should be. First, this was an extraordinarily successful civil rights attorney who made extraordinary differences. Who was the person that argued Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court? Mr. Justice, not then Mr. Justice, then Thurgood Marshall, who made the argument and won and changed in such fundamental ways what was going on in the United States, because it wasn't just what was going on in schools where we had racial segregation, but that was the first major test that made it clear that separate but equal, even if it was equal, which it rarely was unacceptable. He, of course, became the first African-American member of the United States Supreme Court. When President Lyndon Johnson appointed him in 1967, the president said, "It's the right thing to do, the right time to do it, the right man, and the right place." Mr. Justice Marshall was dedicated to reshaping American society for all of us. He was dedicated to representing what he called the voiceless American. So these contributions that he made, and many others, really inspire all of us and should do so. So we're proud to pay tribute to Mr. Justice Thurgood Marshall. Now, there are similarities here. Like Justice Marshall, our keynote speaker this evening is also a man of firsts and a catalyst for change. I won't give you the biography. He will be introduced later, but in 1970, Ron Dellums became the first African-American elected to Congress from a majority white congressional district. So this was a person who built coalitions from the very beginning. Throughout his congressional career, through his retirement from Congress just in 1998, he was an ardent promoter of peace, arguing for meaningful arms control and for the use of diplomacy in conflict resolution. Now, this is something I can actually speak to from some experience, having testified before then Congressman Dellums a number of times on the Hill. Let me tell you something. This was a man who proved, if anyone had any doubt, that you can be a patriot and still question policies, that you can be a patriot and still believe that that requires spending as much as possible on defense, that you can be a patriot and question weapon systems that one service or one group or one special interest is dedicated to. And so he had an extraordinary degree of credibility among all, even though at the same time he was shaking the place. It was a great privilege and a great service paid to our country. But it wasn't only defense policy and foreign policy in which he was engaged. Among his many achievements in his leadership role was really, he was a key figure in ending U.S. support for South Africa's apartheid regime, which is at least as important of any of those other actors. He was a key figure in designing the National Health Service Act, a comprehensive health care program for Americans. Global health issues remain high on his agenda. I'm sure he'll be talking about them this evening. Global health issues broadly, with particular emphasis, because it requires it, on AIDS and what it's meaning worldwide. Now, the late UCLA alumnus and Nobel Prize winner Ralph Bunche once said, and I quote, "If you want to get across an idea, wrap it up in a person." And Ron Dellums is such a person, filled with ideas, a messenger with a message, who's helped to make enormously important changes in our country and around the world. And so we're indeed privileged to have him here tonight in this event sponsored by UCLA's Center for African American Studies. You'll have an opportunity to hear from him later. I just wanted to say these words of welcome and support for all of you, to thank you for joining us this evening, and to turn the program back to our Glenda Weiner. Not our MC, to Glenda.
Well, Mr. Carnesel, I wish I looked that good in red, but I don't. I'm Renee Campbell again, and I thank you again for, as Glenda would say, staying with us. Stay tuned. I am so thrilled tonight because one does not often have the privilege to introduce someone who is their hero, and that is someone who inspires them to do their best. And that is the pleasure and the honor that I have tonight, to introduce the woman who always makes a difference. A person who is so thoughtful and so intelligent that I just can jump up out of the bed to get to work, to call her, to ask her a question because of her energy and because of her enthusiasm. Connie Rice is the co-director of the Advancement Project and is known for the success in tackling problems of inequity and exclusion. She received more than 50 major awards for her leadership in diverse coalitions that remove barriers to opportunities. She always makes a difference whenever she takes on a project. Our problem is we put too many projects on her plate. She graduated from Harvard College in 1978, and then she won the Ruth Tilden Public Interest Scholarship to New York University School of Law, where she earned her law degree in 1984. She was a law clerk to the Honorable Damon Keith, who is a justice for the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. And after that, she became a litigation associate for the San Francisco law firm of Morrison & Foerster. But Morrison & Foerster didn't quite move fast enough for Ms. Rice. So she joined the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. You see, she had met Thurgood Marshall. She had discussed with him what it is that he wanted her to do. And what he told her was that she had, and all of us have, a whole lot more work to do than even they had to do. And boy, was he right. And at LDF, Ms. Rice took on that challenge, and she litigated class action civil rights cases involving police misconduct, something that we know a little bit about today. She litigated employment discrimination, fair public resources allocation, and transportation equity. She filed a landmark case on behalf of low-income bus riders that resulted in a decree mandating more than $1 billion to be spent to improve the system serving the poor. Not just the people that want to ride the metro, the people that are out there every day on those buses. And she still today is working to make sure that that money is spent. And during her tenure at LDF in the Los Angeles office, that office won more than $1.6 billion worth of injunctive release and damages through class actions that were brought on behalf of multiracial coalitions of LDF clients. In her non-litigation work, her spare time, which she has many of, she served as counsel to the Watts gang truce, and she spearheaded a statewide campaign to save equal opportunity programs. She worked tirelessly to try and defeat Proposition 209. During the 1994 and 1995 mayoral years, the late Mayor Tom Bradley and Richard Riordan appointed Rice to the governing boards of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. As only one of 4 people to be appointed by both mayors to that city commission, she served as president of that board and enacted contracting reforms, environmental advantages, and equitable policies. In 1998, the Los Angeles Times designated Rice as one of 24 leaders considered the most experienced, civic-minded, and thoughtful people on the subject of Los Angeles. And in that same year, the California Law Business named her one of the state's top 100 lawyers. Frequently interviewed by both local and national media, Rice has appeared on 60 Minutes, on the Jim Lear News Hour, on the Oprah Winfrey Show, This Week with David Brinkley, and the news programs such as NPR, my favorite, CBS, NBC, and ABC. She is a regular guest on Which Way LA, which is the KCRW NPR show, Weekend Review, and other California programs. Reporters from many publications consult and quote her on a regular basis, including the Los Angeles Times. I hope you all saw her piece last week on driving while black and the legislation that is now currently on the governor's desk. The Daily News quotes her, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the San Francisco Chronicle, and I could go on. She's also quoted in a number of books. One is The Big Test, Colorblind by Ellis Coase, Race Rules by Michael Eric Dyson, and Colorblind by Lydia Chavez. Rice is the co-founder of the Advancement Project and a public policy advocacy and resource organization that provides national and local support for community organizations working to advance racial and socioeconomic justice. Hallmarks of her work include getting results, reducing group conflict, and transforming adversaries into allies. I have personally witnessed that, and that is an incredible event when someone who you are absolutely at odds with, and you can have the skills to turn them around and become a person that can work with and become an ally to. So we will hear from her tonight twice. We'll hear from her right now, and later you can tune in to ABC. It's not a plug for ABC, but she'll be on Nightline with Ted Koppel at 11:30, and I hope you hear her there. So please join me in welcoming Connie Rice.
Good evening, everybody. And Renee, thank you for that extravagant introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. The UCLA Center for the Study of African American Studies is extremely important. It is through the African American experience that America can learn her soul. If we do not have centers that document the experience of African Americans on this continent, not only will we not understand how America will actually become achieved, but we will also forget that history. Just look at the Jewish experience. It doesn't take much to deny it, and we must support these centers to document our role in creating this country and giving a template and a prism through which to understand the greatest nation on earth that should become what it was meant to be. I am here in a redundant capacity because, Chancellor, you gave a fantastic introduction. There's nothing that I can say to improve on it, so I will be here but briefly. This year 2000 Thurgood Marshall Lecture, which we will receive from the Honorable Ronald Dellums, one of the lions not only in Congress, from the mean streets of Oakland. I do have the privilege of adding to the initial introduction. But before that, I was reading again Thurgood Marshall's, one of his biographies, and it's such an important namesake to this lecture. It's not just a namesake. This was a man who, as a little boy, was a hellion, and who when I look in South Central and I see that 2/3 of African American males between the ages of 18 and 29 are, between those ages, at some point incarcerated, jailed, or imprisoned. I think that the great late Justice Thurgood Marshall would say that we have a long way to go. I am the great-granddaughter of slaves, not the great-great-granddaughter, the great-granddaughter. It is only 4 generations, and I'm standing before you at this podium looking out on an audience of doctors and lawyers and PhD candidates in psychology, even one in mathematics. I'm looking at some of the most accomplished people in this city, Winston Dobie. I'm looking at an amazing group of people. Dean Claudia Mitchell-Kernan. When I was at UCLA, that was my first introduction to some of the leaders in the African American community here. We've come a long way. We have a lot to be proud of. I see business people, but and they're successful, but I also know that our access to capital is too low. For South Central to have a wealth-generating economy, it is a $6 billion proposition. We need to stop coming up with $4 million solutions. When I look at the mass incarceration rate, and I think of what Thurgood Marshall would say, I was looking for the words, because I do look for inspiration from our previous leaders. And in his last words, his last speech, which he gave in, I believe, 1992, July 4th, 1992, he received a $100,000 prize from an organization that rewards warriors for justice over a lifetime. And he said, quote, this is 1992 now, right after the riots here in Los Angeles. He said, "We cannot play ostrich. Democracy cannot flourish amid fear. Liberty cannot bloom amid hate. Justice cannot take root amid rage. We must go against the prevailing wind. We must dissent from the indifference. We must dissent from the apathy. We must dissent from the fear, the hatred, and the mistrust. Take a chance, won't you? Knock down the fences that divide. Tear apart the walls that imprison. Reach out. Freedom lies on the other side, just on the other side." Justice Marshall's last words to us were those words. He never uttered another public speech. When I think of the Honorable Ronald Dellums, I think of someone who his entire life has been knocking down walls. He was described, and I have to say this, just the other night, listening to the G. Gordon Liddy radio show. Don't ask. You have to listen to conservative talk radio if you want to know what the politicians are going to respond to. The G. Gordon Liddy show, doesn't that say a lot? The G. Gordon Liddy show, listing in the pantheon of people that you never, ever want to see re-elected to Congress or any other position of power. And who did he list? The Honorable Ronald Dellums. I have to say, there's no better tribute. I don't know if any of us can imagine what it means as the very first African American in the history of this country to be elected by a majority white district, as Chancellor Conosal noted. I don't know how you got the tag of radical from the 60s. That's a feat that many African American politicians have a hard time repeating now in 2000, the year 2000. But to stride into the halls of one of the most powerful bodies in the most powerful nation in the country, just figuring out where the bathroom is first, never mind a strategy for heading 2 major committees. And the first major committee, they didn't call him Mr. Chairman. It was not until he took over the helm of the all-powerful Committee on National Security, as it's called now, but it was the Defense Committee. And see, this is a man who knows where power is. He knows how to follow the money. Most of our tax dollars go to buy B-1 bombers. And it was on that committee. Do you know what it takes to stand up in a pro-defense? It's almost like taking on the police in LA. You can't do it politically. You're out. But to stride into those halls, take over the chairmanship of that committee, and to stand up there and argue for demilitaristic notions, values of peace, values of multinational disarmament. the values of spending money on bread and butter instead of guns. That's the kind of courage that warrants him giving us a lecture tonight. It is extremely difficult to stand up and say things that will get you defunded, disenfranchised, and perhaps dethroned. It is also extremely difficult to be an African American politician. You operate in extraordinary constraints because African Americans don't pay for their politicians. You have to walk the fault lines and the tightropes of party loyalty, the raising of money that all politicians have to do. And it is not always easy to do the right thing. No one can always do the right thing. And in his 27 years in Congress, most of the time we could count on the Honorable Ronald Dellums to stand up, ask the right questions, ask the questions that could get him shown the door. And it is that kind of courage that Thurgood Marshall was talking about when he summoned us and said, knock down the walls that divide and tear down the walls that imprison. It is indeed an honor, and we hope to learn a lot more from him about the rules and the lessons of what it means to hold that kind of power and how we can actually turn our power into vehicles that will realize the great promise of this country. We are in for a real treat tonight to hear from a man who has documented his life, called Lying Down with the Lions, from the mean streets of Oakland to the halls of power. And he wasn't just lying down with lions, he is one of the lions, and we are very privileged to hear from him tonight. The Honorable Ronald Dellums.
To our Mistress of Ceremony, to the distinguished members of the administration, distinguished faculty, students of UCLA, to the officers and staff of the center, to the faculty of the African American Studies Department, to the sponsors, to the guests, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to thank Ms. Rice for a very thoughtful and very humbling introduction. I'm deeply appreciative. To you, Mr. Chancellor, thank you very much also for your very kind and generous remarks. To all of you who have made it possible for me to come here, I'd like to thank you. I deem this both an honor and a great privilege to be here. Thurgood Marshall, as was said earlier, was an extraordinary human being, and to ask to come here to give this lecture is very important to me. I think this is an extraordinary podium. I hope in the few moments that I'm with you that I will use it with some degree of effectiveness. First, I'd like to start lightly. You mentioned being attacked by G. Gordon Liddy. He was a lightweight. I was attacked by people higher than that. Just to tell you, and particularly those of you who are the young people here, I had just won the primary in 1970. And I went to bed one night, and it was probably the earliest that I had gotten to bed because it was 18-hour days. I lost 20 pounds campaigning, running back and forth across streets around the neighborhood. 18 hours a day campaigning. The phone rings one night, and my campaign manager, Kermit Scott, he says, "Ron, you won't believe this. You've been attacked by Vice President Spiro Agnew." And this is when Vice President Agnew had been going around the country attacking rad-lib senators and, using this interesting vocabulary to challenge. And I remember one day, someone said, "Ron, wouldn't it be fascinating if Vice President Agnew attacked you?" And I said, "Man, Vice President Agnew doesn't even know who I am." So he calls me this night and he says, "You've been attacked by Vice President Agnew." I said, "Man, don't joke. I'm tired, man. I got a long day tomorrow." No, really. Vice President Agnew attacked you from the podium in Arkansas at a major fundraiser, called you an out-and-out radical that needed to be purged from American politics. You're perhaps the most dangerous person on the verge of becoming a member of the United States Congress. I sat straight up. Really? Call a press conference tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I'll be there. So about 5 minutes to 10 the next morning, I'm standing across the street, getting ready, waiting for the light to change to walk into my campaign office. There were more press than I had seen in my life. They had come from all over the world. And I don't think to see who Ron Dellums was, but more to see what Ron Dellums was. And just when I was about to cross the street, I looked to my right, and there was this little old white woman walking very slowly with a cane. And I turned toward her, and she looked at me, and she said, "Are you Ron Dellums?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." And she said, "I just walked 10 blocks to give you this." And she pulled out of her pocket a check for $5 and handed it to me. And she said, "That's all I had. But anyone attacked by Vice President Agnew, I had to support." And it was one of those wonderful human moments that you will never forget. Because here's this short white woman, this lanky black guy, and we hugged each other with tears in our eyes. And then she turned to walk her slow 10 blocks home, and I crossed the street to walk into my future. I remember I walked in the campaign office and it pressed from everywhere. And I was incredibly nervous. And my campaign manager walked up to me and he said, "We've been working all night on this statement. You ought to read the statement before the press conference." I said, "What statement?" He said, "Well, we prepared a statement for you. This is big time stuff. Attacked by the vice president." And so I'm sure that the press came to see a guy dance on the winds of expediency, reading a very carefully crafted, artfully drawn statement about what I'm not and what it. And I said, "I'm not reading any statement. I have nothing to hide, and I will simply sit and answer any questions, and let's see what happens." He said, "You really want to do this?" I said, "Let's go." He said, "But first you ought to at least read what Vice President Agnew said." Well, I was so nervous when I picked up the stack of press statements, I noticed that my hand was trembling. But I was born in the hood. And the code of the hood is maintain your cool at all costs. So I faked it as if I was speed reading, which would account for the rapid movement of my hand. And so I'm going, huh? Didn't see a word. Absolutely nervous beyond comprehension. So I said, "Okay, I'm ready." So he said, "You sure you don't want to read a statement?" So I walked over, sat down, microphones dripping off the table. And there was a pregnant pause because the press was there. They were prepared for me to read this carefully drawn statement to frame myself. And I said, "I have no opening statement. I have nothing to hide. If the vice president chooses to challenge, I'm open to answer any questions you have." So it was a moment of silence, and then someone says, "Vice President Agnew charges that you're a radical, out-and-out radical who need to be purged from American politics. How do you respond to that charge?" Charge. Rather than ask me, what are your politics as opposed to Vice President Agnew's politics that caused him to challenge you? But they said, charge. If Vice President Agnew, if it is radical to oppose the insanity and the cruelty of the Vietnam War, if it is radical to oppose racial and economic oppression, if it is radical to want to eradicate poverty and hunger and disease and inadequate education and all the other forms of human misery visited upon millions of people, then, sir, I am proud to be called a radical. Silence. Because they came to see a caricature dance. But I had learned from my mother early in life, you never let the other guy define who you are. You define who you are. And you be confident in that definition of who you are. And she told me a long time back that I was black, that I was of African descent, that I was 1,000 adjectives that described a very complex human being whose name was Ronald Dellums. So no vice president was going to determine who I was. I would determine who I am. So if that's what radical meant, cool. I'm very pleased to be called a radical. Second question. Vice President Agnew charges that you advocate bringing down the walls. How do you respond to that charge? If Vice President Agnew had taken the time out of his busy schedule as Vice President of the United States to understand my comments in context, what he would have learned is that I said we have built walls very high and very thick in this country among the races, the classes, the sexes, the generations, and even the religions. And if we bring down those walls, what we will find are millions of human beings across race, across class, across gender, across culture, leading very desperate and miserable lives. And if we're ever able to bring all of those people together in a massive coalition, we can change America and change the world. So yes, sir, I plead guilty to the politics of bringing down the walls of racism, the walls of sexism, the walls of age, chauvinism, and all the other isms that divide human beings and keep them from coming together to bend the political will. Pause. No other questions. That was the end of the press conference because it didn't fit the mold. And so that's how I came to Congress. Richard Nixon put me on the top 10 enemy list. So if you ever see Richard Nixon's enemy list, I am proud to be number 6 on Richard Nixon's enemy list. One other quick story, and then I want to get into my remarks. Both of you mentioned the Armed Services Committee. But my first day on the Armed Services Committee was an interesting, fascinating day. It was in my second term. My first term, I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee and the District of Columbia Committee. In my second term, we decided that if we were truly going to be peace advocates, we really wanted to radically alter the priorities of this country, then we needed to go into the bastion of militarism. Somebody black and somebody who was a peace-oriented human being needed to go on the House Armed Services Committee. And Pat Schroeder from Denver, Colorado was elected at that very same time, 2 years behind myself. And so the two of us ended up on the Armed Services Committee over the open opposition of the then chair of the committee, F. Edward Hebert of Louisiana. I was the black Berkeley bomb thrower, and she was the white woman Denver bomb thrower, and that's how they saw us. So the first day we come to a meeting, here are two people. I'm senior to Pat Schroeder because I'm 2 years. So Pat Schroeder's here, I'm here. Two new members of the committee, but they only had one chair. And it was such an incredibly petty thing. And it would only allow one chair. Now, everything inside me, coming from West Oakland, coming out of the cauldron of our community, politics shaped in Berkeley, everything inside me wanted to stand up and to rage. But my mother also taught me something else. She said, always take the play away. So I turned to Pat Schroeder, who I had just met during the Democratic caucus, and I said, look, sister, if it's cool with you, let's sit here cheek to cheek on this one chair as if it is the most normal thing in the world. And let's not give these people the luxury of thinking that they could take us off at such an incredibly petty level. So we both sat there in the first meeting, cheek to cheek. And I was to later tell that story upon the occasion of Pat Schroeder's retirement from the Congress. And because they assembled a number of people to tell Pat Schroeder stories. And so I have to tell this part, because I could never tell this story without adding this. So when I told that story, Barney Frank, who was a member of Congress from Massachusetts, who I think is a brilliant guy, incredible thinker, as soon as I told the story, in the middle of this crowd, he goes, and that was the last half-assed thing either one of them ever did in the Congress of the United States. There are thoughts and ideas and information that I wish to share with you tonight. Speakers often use words to paint a picture. And often when a picture is painted, after a picture is painted, you frame it. I would like to do it the other way. Before I paint the picture, I would like to establish the framework, 4 sides of the picture that I want to frame, with a few very quick remarks, so that as I speak, this is the framework within which I would like you to assess and evaluate and assess what this means to each of you. The first point has often been said is knowledge is power. And with power, with knowledge comes power. But I add something else. With knowledge comes responsibility. So I operate from one very simple premise and one very simple principle, and that is that each of us in our own way must always assume the responsibility of the knowledge we possess. Each of us in our own way must assume the responsibility for the knowledge we have. So knowledge is not only power, it brings responsibility. The second point that I wish to make, Martin Luther King was a very inspiring person to me because I thought he was brilliant, courageous, eloquent, with great integrity, and was an extraordinary teacher. The second part of the frame, Martin Luther King pointed out that peace is more than simply the absence of war. It is the presence of justice. And when he said that, I thought it was such a marvelous, wonderful, incredible idea. Because in that one simple statement, he helped me understand that true peace is not simply ending war, it is ending injustice. Because if you turn it over, peace is more than simply the absence of war, it is the absence of conditions that give rise to conflict and give rise to war. Therefore, the ultimate movement is the movement for true peace, because under that banner, you are capable of challenging all forms of oppression in all of the ways in which it is visited upon human beings and it affects the human condition. Peace is more than simply the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. Third part of the frame, Martin Luther King's comment. We were the young revolutionaries at the time, and here's this minister, civil rights advocate, makes the following statement. The most revolutionary act that our people can engage in is to assert the full measure of their citizenship. And I wrote that down. I thought that was another incredible comment. What is this man saying to me? Simply stated, what Martin Luther King was saying was that if we seek major change, step forward boldly and assert your rights and prerogatives as a citizen and assume your duties. And so what Martin Luther King was saying was, you really want to be revolutionary, don't let the other guy debate and discuss your status, assert it. And if you think about that, to step forward into the political process and assert very aggressively, I am a citizen and I will be dealt with, is a very powerful thing. I am somebody is a psychological statement. I am a citizen is a political statement. So to assert your rights, to assert your prerogatives, how many of us, well, they don't take us seriously. they're kind of taking us for granted. They're not going to come to our community. They're not going to solve the problems. It's never going to change. If you look at me, even saying those things, my body language changes. You assume the position of a victim. But when you stand up and say, I am a citizen, I will be dealt with, I have rights and prerogatives, I am here, you will deal with me, that is a very strong thing. But it also means assuming your responsibilities. That means that to be informed, to be knowledgeable, and to engage the process. And as a 64-year-old gray-haired guy, let me say to all of you young people that the process is always better informed by your activism and by your engagement and by your involvement. Never allow cynicism to deny you the opportunity to participate, to change America and to change the world. Fourth point, part of the frame. Martin Luther King again. Generosity is more than throwing a few crumbs to a beggar, but it is dealing with those circumstances in society and conditions in society that give rise to poverty. Generosity is more than throwing a few crumbs to a beggar. It is dealing with those circumstances inherent in society that give rise to poverty. Which means that if we really want to be generous, then we must change the conditions that create oppression and create harm for ourselves and our fellow citizens. That is the framework. We always seal a picture from the back, and so my sealer is, I'm a political activist. And as I said earlier, I believe the political process is always better informed by your activism, by your involvement, and by your participation. Those of us in this room who have gray hair, who were either matured in the 60s or were inspired by the 60s, we changed the world. And I can say that without fear of contradiction. We changed the world. We didn't make it perfect, but we changed the world. It is now your turn as young people in this room and as the not so young people who are their supporters. It is now your turn to save this world, to take the next step, to finish the unfinished business. Now, having said that, let me paint the picture. First, I want to talk with you briefly about something about which I have great passion and something that I think is important and vital to all of us in this room. And that is the global pandemic of HIV/AIDS that at this particular moment is simply manifesting itself most dramatically, most profoundly, and most painfully in the sub-Saharan African context. But it is truly a global problem. It is a global problem because India at this moment is a time bomb ticking. In a recent article 2 weeks ago on the Sunday front page of the Washington Post, they quoted an infection rate in India of 8.2%. With a billion people population, that's 82 million people affected with HIV/AIDS in India alone. And I'm going to give you some horrifying data about what is happening in sub-Saharan Africa, but I think what is evolving in India may in raw terms even transcend that. I would not be shocked or surprised that over the next few years that in Russia, down through the Balkans and Eastern Europe, we will be looking at an infection rate of between 5 and 10%. It is also a time bomb ticking in other parts of Asia. It is a time bomb ticking in Brazil and other parts of Central America. In the United States, the face of AIDS has changed. 42% of the people dying of AIDS in America are African Americans. 28% are Latino Americans, which means 70% of the people now dying of AIDS in America are people of color. Every hour in America, there are 2 teenagers newly affected with AIDS. So many of us have allowed ourselves in the context of the United States to lull ourselves into a sense of complacency that some kind of way we are on top of this. But if you step back and take a global view, this issue is expanding and expanding rapidly. Now, for a moment, let me pause and go to sub-Saharan Africa. Since the first case of AIDS was discovered in Africa, between 11 and 12 million Africans have died of AIDS. between 11 and 12 million. Africans are dying at a rate of between 6,000 and 7,000 a day in Africa. There are between 11 and 12,000 newly infected people in Africa daily. It is anticipated that this year, somewhere above 2.3 million Africans will die of AIDS. In the next 10 years, extrapolating out, that means 23 to 25 million Africans will die in the first 10 years of the 21st century. How can the human mind even grapple with that order of death and suffering and human misery? In terms of life expectancy, one of the great contributors to the drop of life expectancy in Sierra Leone is HIV and AIDS. The life expectancy in Sierra Leone, as we gather tonight, is 35 and falling. In Zimbabwe, life expectancy is 38 and falling. All over southern Africa, life expectancy has dropped into the 40s and falling. All over Africa, we have lost an average of 20 years of life expectancy. When I retired from the Congress in February of 1998, there were 7.8 million children who were orphaned. As we speak, we now have reached the figure of 10 million. Some people anticipate that by the end of this year, we will be looking at numbers between 12 and 14 million. The United Nations and the World Health Organization, extrapolating out, suggest that by the year 2010 there will be 40 million children in sub-Saharan Africa orphaned as a direct result of AIDS. You do not have to be an academician. You do not have to be a brilliant PhD. You just have to be a person plugged into the reality. When you consider what the implications of 40 million children on the continent of Africa with no parents, with millions of children in Africa now struggling every single day, either dealing with themselves or dealing with each other, trying to survive. At a time when, at one point in Africa, there wasn't even a concept of homeless children. That is now a reality. Go anywhere in Africa and look into the eyes of millions of children with no sense of hope, with desperation, pain, and suffering. This is an incredible problem. There are countries in Africa where teachers are dying at a rate faster than their students. And when you think about the power of teachers in the lives of young people, the symbolism, the power that they have, when children look up, the teacher is everything. I don't ever recall a teacher dying in my childhood, but in Africa that is an everyday occurrence. And when you think about countries trying to stand up educational institutions at a time when their professionals are dying at a rate faster than their students, the implications are astronomical. There are places in Africa where insurance cannot be sold because people cannot calculate the actuarial charts. There are employers in Africa who employ 3 and 4 people for the same job because they know the first 2 or 3 people are going to die over the next several months. The implications here are incredible. So this is not solely a health issue. This is an issue that cuts across the entire span of the human experience. This can topple governments. It can collapse economies. It is causing poverty to spiral out of control. Think about the children armies that are functioning in Africa now and add in 40 million children. In South Central, when you talk to young people who are members of gangs, what do they say to you? They say, "This is my family." Well, multiply that by 40 million, and the implications here are incredible. So on the one hand, the level of death, the level of suffering, the loss of life expectancy. So at what point does the life expectancy drop so far that the people who have the resources to get out, the last person to leave the continent, turn off the lights, the party's over? But we cannot afford to do that. It's like one African woman in responding to a speech that I gave made a sobering statement so powerful that I looked around the room. There wasn't a dry eye in the room, and her comment was very simple. If we don't do something significant about dealing with the problem of AIDS that is attacking the age group between 15 and 49, which is responsible for producing the future, that Africa is going to end up a continent of old men and old women. So what then is our responsibility? Against the backdrop of those 4 points that I made to you, hopefully there is a sense of where we need to go. But this is not an African problem. Africans do not own this issue. HIV and AIDS is a preventable, infectious disease that does not respect race, gender, sexual orientation, age, class, border, or boundary. So the notion of a domestic program and an international program is an antiquated way to look at this issue. This is a global problem that requires a global response, and America has to be an integral part of a global responsibility. And we all have to participate. It is the human family that is in jeopardy. I am not an AIDS expert. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I've never run an AIDS program. But if I have any expertise, I'm a loudmouth political activist. And part of that responsibility is to be educative, to make people uncomfortable, and hopefully to try to inspire people to do something about a level of injustice that is incredible. Peace is more than simply the absence of war. It is the presence of justice. It is immoral and unacceptable that the world can stand by and allow millions of people to die, millions of people to suffer, millions of people to lose life expectancy, and millions of children to be orphaned. But Africa is just the tip of the iceberg. It is phase 1, people. Wait until India explodes. Wait until Eastern Europe explodes. Wait until Central America explodes. Wait until we realize, even in this country, that we're expanding. So the implications here, when you think about it, are incredible. We need a Marshall Plan approach. We need a public-private partnership unheralded in the human experience, because this is a pandemic that is unequaled in the human experience. The Black Plague in Europe cannot touch what is happening with HIV/AIDS. And so we cannot function as ostriches. We must stand up and see it and address it. In talking with, because I'm on a very steep learning curve, because I'm trying to absorb as much as I can about this problem. And what I'm learning from people who are experts, who are saying that each time the human family was unsuccessful in combating an infectious disease, the next infectious disease is further complicated by that failure. For example, we're looking at HIV/AIDS, and many HIV/AIDS patients have tuberculosis. We did a horrible job with tuberculosis. We did a terrible job with gonorrhea and other sexually transmitted diseases. And so many HIV patients, there is tuberculosis. There are other infectious diseases, opportunistic diseases. There are sexually transmitted diseases. So it's in our interest. It's not only a moral imperative, that ought to be obvious to all of us. And I'm sure in this room I don't have to preach about that. You're here because you have a sense of moral outrage about injustice. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. But there's also a compelling self-interest. It is the human family that is threatened, and the human family must come together to address this problem. It has enormous potential for coalition building. Sexuality is the great leveler. We all always knew that. And now we have HIV and AIDS that is cutting across all of the lines that divide us. So the potential for forces that have never come together, or who have come together gingerly, now there's a basis and a rationale for people coming together to build mighty coalitions to bend the political will. We need billions of dollars to address this problem. And while it is a global problem, Africa is phase 1, so it's in everybody's interest to focus on Africa. And we know for a lot of reasons that developing countries always end up being the tail end. Well, this must be the first time that the human family understands that its self-interest is in moving to address this problem in Africa first, because it is important to do so. So we need a public-private partnership that achieves billions of dollars. But I'm also learning that you can't solve the problem of AIDS in a vacuum. How do I get from my village to your village to your village to treat AIDS if there are no good roads? So you're in the developmental business. How do you treat AIDS without a healthcare delivery system? So now you're in the infrastructure healthcare business. How do you treat AIDS without hospitals and clinics? You're in the business of building hospitals and clinics. How do you teach children about AIDS who cannot read? You're in the education business. Where are we going to get this money? Sub-Saharan African countries are paying $31 billion a year in debt service on debts that many of them Cold War era debts, faulty assumptions. It is obscene that these impoverished countries are paying $31 billion in debt service. So we not only must call for a Marshall Plan approach, we must also call for debt forgiveness. These debts must be forgiven. These countries must be, the burden of paying back $31 billion in debt service annually must be removed from their backs so that they can take that $31 billion and build healthcare infrastructure and educational infrastructures and development that will improve the quality of life of people in African countries and enhance the capacity of African countries to deal with the problem of AIDS. And we have both a compelling moral obligation to contribute to that and participate in that mightily, and we also have a keen self-interest in doing so. So one of my messages is that the unfinished business, if Thurgood Marshall were here, he could not ignore the global AIDS problem. If Martin Luther King were here, we could not ignore the global AIDS problem. This is a real issue here, and we have to address it. African Americans, what does that mean? African is our ancestry, American is our citizenship. I combine those to say we have a compelling responsibility here to use our citizenship to challenge this nation and challenge the world to come to the aid of Africa. Now, my hidden agenda, if we're smart, and I think we can be, if we are purposeful, and I know we can be, we can use this issue as the great Trojan horse. Africa has been nickeled and dimed for years. But if we assert ourselves correctly, we can challenge America and the world to come to the aid of Africa in ways that it never would have done in the past. So that maybe if we're forceful, maybe if we're thoughtful, maybe if we're purposeful, maybe if we're guided by high moral principles and an understanding about our mutual self-interest, that we can turn this incredible tragedy that is now destroying Africa into an issue that can revitalize and rebuild and expand Africa. So it is not out of a sense of noble obligation that I stand here asserting this. It's not out of a sense of romanticism that I do so. It is out of our collective self-interest that we must address this problem. Now, having said that, in whatever few moments that I have remaining, I want to address this issue. Where do we go from here in terms of the civil rights movement? A question was asked today, what do we do with Proposition 209? I know here that this is a real problem. This is a real issue. You look at the law school, you look at the numbers, you look at other places, this is the number. So there's a reality here. Thank you, I appreciate that. This is a real issue, it's a very real problem. How do we confront it? I'm gonna give you my thought. At some point, all of the people that went before us, their suffering and their dying had to mean something. And so I don't think we need to play that same old tune over again. Martin Luther King said the most revolutionary act that you can engage in is to assert the full measure of your citizenship. At what point do we say, without equivocation, with strength, and straightforwardness. I am here, you will deal with me. 40 years ago, our assertion was that this was a majority white nation and there were a few minorities that we needed to figure out how to get them inside. That's no longer the reality of America. America, on an everyday increasing basis, is becoming multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic. California is America. California today is America tomorrow. That's a reality that is becoming so obvious and so clear and so incredibly compelling that what I'm suggesting is that if there is now a next step for the civil rights movement, is that we have to be smart enough to begin to frame the debate not in 40-year-old terms. We frame the debate in 21st century terms. America is multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and it's not about minority, it's not about diversity, it's about reality. We are here and we're going to be part of this. And that any state and in this country, if we're not smart enough to realize that we need to educate every single young person who has the desire and the will and the talent to be educated, we are going to be left behind in this world. We have got to talk about broadening the parameters of education so that we've got to get out of the box of fighting over the handful of this many positions. We've got to engage the political process to talk about changing radically the priorities of this country so that we're not still, I went to Congress fighting against $300 billion military budgets. It's now moving back toward $300 billion. But where's the discussion about that? Where's the debate about that? Where's the outrage about that? So if we're going to talk about the future of the civil rights movement, we've got to talk about building coalitions and building alliances. That white guy that's saying, I lost my job because of affirmative action, or I lost my place in the school because of affirmative action, we've got to say, look, man, you're being played for a chump. That it is scapegoat politics that is rearing its head here. It's scapegoat politics. And that the political process has not created the kind of priorities that open opportunities. I don't have any problem with this white guy's kids going to school. That's ridiculous. Freedom is about everybody's ability to go to school. So look, man, don't allow the process to have you and I battling over whether your kids ought to go to school and my kids ought to go to school and you have a job or I have a job. All of our kids ought to go to school and all of us ought to have a job. So rather than you fighting me about affirmative action, you ought to be joining me about full employment and adequate wage, and you ought to be joining me in radically altering the priorities in this country so we stop spending billions of dollars on wasteful weapon systems and other waste and start to talk about educating our people and putting money where it really desperately needs to be, and that is to address the human misery and the human tragedy. So in the 21st century, we got to finish the business. And finish the business means reframing the discussion and be smart enough to build the political alliances and the political coalition to radically alter the priorities of this country. Proposition 209, go after it. And go after it, one, because the issues have not gone away. And but some kind of way we've got to communicate the message in a very different way. We cannot continue to play scapegoat politics and play into people's hands. Why did Martin Luther King die? He had died to achieve an egalitarian society where everybody's free and equal. And at some point along the way, this struggle has to end. It's like I'm saying to people, look, man, we got to stop playing this. You will not oppress me. I'm too damn old to go backwards. We have to go forward in this country. We got to think about that in a very clear and compelling way. You understand what I'm saying to you? It's changing the nature of how we address this problem. Now, having said that, that's only a process issue. Because we all have to be at the table. And still debating over who's going to be at the table 40 years later. At some point you just walk in and sit down at the table. At some point we're assertive. At some point you step up to it. At some point we stop talking about, our role, our status in society being discussable, negotiable, or debatable. At some point we have to say it isn't. We're here, let's move forward. Because you young people in this room, I cannot even comprehend the world that is being handed over to you. This world is moving at warp speed. The changes that are taking place are incredible in my mind's eye. The issues that all of you are going to have to deal with, AIDS is just one of them. International economics, nuclear proliferation, war and peace, the cyber world. We're all interconnected. Somebody with a little off-the-wall program ties up a big part of the world with a I love you bug. And so it's got to become increasingly clear to, and I don't even understand it. I'm a Neanderthal. My wife says, I'm going to teach you about computers. I got to learn. But one thing I am realizing is that we're so interrelated, interdependent, interconnected, and we're becoming so complex, so tied in together, that it's in our interest to come together. And so the energy we continue to expend playing racist games, bigoted games, discrimination games, prejudice, or energy that is being siphoned off that really needs to be, that really is required to address the myriad problems out there, that's going to require our universality. It's going to require the highest and the best in our thinking. And so racial profiling, get rid of it, man. That is antiquated. We are still talking about being shot down in the black community because of the overwhelming use of force. At some point, that has to end. And that discussion can't be, well, how are we going to know? Change it. That step forward boldly, I am a citizen. No. We're going to change the policies of the use of force. We're going to change how you deal in our communities. But that's only one part of it. Peace is more than simply the absence of war, so putting down the guns in our community is, and this incredible brutality that's taking place, that's only one part of it. But the other part of it is to step forward to deal with those conditions that give rise to the pain and the anguish in our many communities. Unemployment, poverty, lack of access to health care, homelessness, all of these issues, they've got to get dealt with. And what I'm saying to you is that there's an urgency here. And the more time this country spends dealing with racism and discrimination and prejudice is less time that we have to confront the major issues that lie before us that are challenging us at the level of our humanity. And so maybe I'm in the wrong time zone, I don't know. But I'm just saying that at some point, for you young people, if a 64-year-old gray-haired dude can stand up in front of you and say, time for this madness is over, then you have to be brave enough to stand up and courageous enough to stand up and assert your rights and prerogatives as a citizen and say enough is enough and we have to move forward. Now, to have to be fighting with some lame person running around the country debating over whether affirmative action makes sense or not, I mean, that's wasted energy. Look, fool, you go debate by yourself. We're going to end this madness. You understand what I'm saying to you? And I know everyone in this room is committed to diversity. But this is not going to be one person, probably not going to be the chancellor's issue by himself, not going to be the administration's issue, not going to be the faculty's issue. It's when political movement emerges. And if there's any one thing that my message to you is that political activism is significant and important. The Ronald Dellumses of the world come and go. It's not about personalities. It is ideas that ultimately must prevail, and it's that commitment to those ideas that must prevail. And the idea of justice, the idea of equality, the idea of peace that emerged in the 60s are still principles and still values that can guide us into the 21st century. Our discussion and our debate and how we frame the issue must be updated to meet the rapidly changing conditions and objective realities of the world as it is evolving so incredibly fast. So, to very last point, we are now on the throes of a national election. Make use of it. Make use of it. I was saying earlier today, you know, some of you in the room probably tuned in the Apollo Theater debate. How many of you did that? A few of you? This was supposed to be the big debate in the black community, Harlem, New York. You know, everybody who was everybody emerged, you know, was right there in the Apollo Theater. This is the big debate in the black community where the presidential candidates were going to discuss the issues of the black community. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, there are so many issues that have been left off the table. I'm screaming at the TV, who's defining what a black issue is? Right. And I would say to all of you in this room, particularly those of you who are young, I'll give you my answer. Every issue is a black issue. Every issue is a Latino issue. Every issue is an Asian issue. Every issue is a woman issue. Every issue is a gay issue. Every issue is an issue that affects us all. And we have to make political candidates respond to the totality of the issues. So you can't come to the African American community and the only thing you're going to discuss is racial profiling, maybe one other issue. Well, you need to come talk with me about that. I mean, I shouldn't even have to think about that. But when we get finished with you dealing with that issue, now talk to me about all the other issues that affect me as a human being, because I am a total person, I am a citizen, I will be dealt with. So don't come into my community and hit me with two issues that you define as black, get in a car and go across town and talk about foreign policy, national security issues, economic conditions, educational policy, healthcare issues. We have to perceive that as an insult. Right. Yeah. We're here. Remember what Martin Luther King did 40 years ago, and we're still dancing on the winds of 40 years ago. He's incredibly brilliant people. Step forward boldly and assert your rights and prerogatives. So in the year 2000, in the month of May, step forward boldly. People are taken for granted only because they allow themselves to be taken for granted. You have been a wonderful group of people who allowed me to say a lot of things. I hope that I was not boring. I hope that in some way was stimulating. And to the young man that I met earlier tonight, I hope that I could say at least one thing that will touch you in your heart and will inspire you to move forward. Do so. There's too much cynicism and too much sense of individualism. Activism can, when we build the proper alliances and the proper coalitions, you can bend the political process to your will. You've been very kind and very generous, and thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Naisha Dinwiddie, and I'm a second-year graduate student in the Department of African American Studies at UCLA. I would personally like to thank you for your inspirational message and to thank you for your leadership and your commitment to the African American community, as well as being a role model. On behalf of the Center of African American Studies, I would like to present to you this plaque which reads, "The UCLA Center for African American Studies proudly presents this award to Ronald V. Dellums for his leadership and commitment to the civil rights struggle in America and for delivering the keynote address for the 11th Annual Thurgood Marshall Lecture on Law and Human Rights, May 11th, 2000.
Very good.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Carmen Mitchell, and I'm also a second-year graduate student in African American Studies here at UCLA. And on behalf of the City of Los Angeles and the Mayor, Richard Reagan, I would also like to present this proclamation to the Honorable Ronald Dellums, and it reads, whereas Ronald Dellums committed himself to leading progressive social change by representing California's 9th Congressional District from 1970 to 1998, and whereas Congressman Ronald Dellums spearheaded efforts to end wasteful and unnecessary military buildup and advocated for a sensible approach to military defense, and whereas Congressman Dellums vigorously advocated for U.S. participation in international peace operations and for the use of diplomacy and conflict resolution as key elements of U.S. foreign policy. And whereas in 1977, Congressman Dellums initiated legislation for the National Health Service Act, one of the most comprehensive health care proposals to date. Now, therefore, I, Richard J. Reagan, Mayor of the City of Los Angeles, on behalf of its citizens, do hereby commend you on your extraordinary accomplishments and continued public service, and thank you for your contributions on this May 11, 2000.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wasn't our keynote speaker wonderful? He gave us many things to think about. And even more, I think, many things to act on. I want you to know that Esalen Books will be selling copies of Congressman Dellums' new book entitled Lying Down with the Lion, A Public Life from the Streets of Oakland to the Halls of Power. You know, ladies and gentlemen, before we break for the final time, I also do want to announce to you that NOMO, the African Student Union at UCLA, will cordially invite you to join in celebrating the 30th anniversary of NOMO magazine on Friday, May 19th. Reception at 6:30 p.m., dinner at 7:30 p.m. at the UCLA James West Alumni Center. The speakers will be Angela Davis and a certain gentleman who is here this evening, whom we all know and love, Dr. C.Z. Wilson. They will both be the keynote speakers. And you can call for tickets now. I hate giving out numbers like this because I don't imagine there are going to be too many taking this down, but I'll tell you anyway. Area code 310-825-2787. 825-2787. You know, one of the nice things about being in television is that you learn not to have long goodbyes and farewells. I remember that when I was taking Spanish, and I took it for 4 years, I was told by my favorite teacher that a person who has given a speech in Spanish, when he or she is finished, simply says, he dicho, I have spoken. So, ladies and gentlemen, hemos dicho, we have spoken. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for being with us. Drive safely, and see you next year.
Just a reminder on your way out, Esalen Books has the copy of Ron Dellums' book in the waiting area. You can pick up copies there. Thank you very much.